Everyone, we just got today's patch notes for October 2nd, 2025 for Borderlands 4. This update includes some additional balance changes and updates for Vault Hunters. Welcome to our first significant balance patch. Our high level for Borderlands 4 is always to provide players with the tools and means to build the perfect Vault Hunter. Through the combination of gear, firmware, skill, and specialization trees, we want players to experiment and craft theories, then put them to the test in combat. For today's update, we want to focus on creating greater build diversity by adjusting underperformance skills. Amon in particular gets a host of adjustments to bring him closer in line with the general power level of other Vault Hunters, Vex's summons, and Rafa's melee power, the adjustment to make those builds more viable in late endgame. Finally, Harlow has a couple of tweaks to make sure Stasis is getting value for players. Looking to the future, we're investigating stats and behaviors on class mods, rep kits, shields, and firmware to make sure they are providing avenues for greater build diversity. We are also planning to fix a number of unintended interactions. These exploits prevent us from creating a meaningful build diversity and the trivialized content that is otherwise meant to challenge players. I'm guessing what they're adjusting here is the knife. The knife with the penetrator augment, which causes everything to hit crit, and it just has a lot of really weird interactions with one another, and it really does trivialize a lot of things. I still haven't gotten it. In the 65 hours I played this goddamn game, I still not have gotten it a single time. That knife is crazy rare. We're excited about the future of Borderlands 4 and its upcoming post-launch roadmap. This is just the start of an exciting year of updates and content, and we can't wait to experience it all with our community. I cannot read. Please restart your game to ensure the update goes through to prevent connection errors in matchmaking. If you're encountering any issues, go here. All right, change list. Weekly activities. Weekly big encore boss has switched from tougher variant on different existing bosses with an even more rewarding loot pool for those to take it on. Weekly wildcard mission has changed. These missions feature a guaranteed legendary job that you can repeatedly earn to get your ideal role. And then you have Maurice's black market vending machine has moved to another location and changed its offering. Remember, while the location is the same, your vending machine items are different from other players, so ask around, see if someone has the item you are looking for. Additional changes. Added auto clearing of Borderlands 4 stale shaders on version update, preventing performance degradation on some PCs. Very cool, very nice. Now we're into the big patch notes. It looks like Harlow got nothing, which means I think it means she's like pretty good. It seems like Rafa, Vex, and especially Amon needed a lot of things to like get brought up. So I think Harlow right now is in a pretty good place. And as I'm playing her, I kind of agree. Character balance adjustments. Harlow, action skills, 0 point. Stasis slam increased by 30% and stasis immune damage increased by 14.7%. I might have to switch around the build just to see how that one goes, but genuinely, I'm surprised they're doing this. All right. Rafa, action skills, Apophis Lance, increased damage by 10%. Capstones, People Person, Protect Raiju, damage now scales by 12% per second, up from 10%. Okay, so 2% increase. Project Basilisk damage increased by 15%. Project Basilisk hazard damage increased by 25%. And Project Gorgon damage increased by 17%. Passives, People Person, El Catrin, critical hit damage increase to 8% from 7%. Bonus shock damage increase from 8% to 7% per point per my last. Double damage chance increase to 6% from 5% per count. Okay. Action skills, Arc Knives. Melee attack damage increased by 12%. Dash damage increased by 5%. Passives, this year's gimmick. Handshake Deal. Melee damage increased to 9% from 7% per point to the last. Skill damage increased to 8% from 6% per point. El Paragus. Splash damage increased to 9% from 7% per point. Liquidation. Damage increased by 50%. Collaborative Ignition. Bonus damage increased to 8% from 6% per point. Sinergia. Duration increased to 14 seconds from 12 seconds. Melee damage increased to 4% from 3% per point. Empuje. The action skill duration increased from 7% to from 6% per point. All right, those are all your changes from Rafa. A little bit bumps here and there, maybe to make the consistency feel a lot better, but some of these like increased by 25%, increased by 15%, and then the one down here, where was it? Yeah, increased by 50%. And then Arc Knives, like, wow, this is crazy changes just for Rafa on his own, and it seems like we have a lot more. So let's see what Vex got. Vex, action skills, Incarnate, phase explosion damage increased by 16.6%, Eldritch Blast increased by 9.5%. Augments, Vexcalation, Energy Vampire damage increased by 25%. That is insane. Vex is my second character. I play with Incarnate, but I also play the one where I summon the Reapers and the Specters, and I mainly tend to lean more towards using the Specters just because they deal a lot of damage and they hit critical hits on their own, and they get a lot of the buffs that I end up getting due to like kill skills and stuff, right? Incarnate is powerful, but it was lacking a bit of something. Hopefully this makes her feel a lot better. Augments, Vexcalation. Right, that's the one I just read. Capstones, Vexcalation. Heart Piercer damage increased by 22%, Desecration Hazard damage increased by 50%, Desecration Airborne Burst increased by 48%, and Geist Wave damage increased by 41%. That is crazy. Passives, Vexcalation. Radiant Attunement now deals 7% splash damage, up from 6% per point. Dreadlight Hazard damage increased by 100%, and Ars Arcana now increases skill damage by 9% from 8% per point. Dreadlight Hazard damage increased by 100%. Wild. Action skills, Phase Familiar. Trouble health increased by 10%, trouble damage increased by 21.9%. Augments, here comes Trouble. Violent Outburst damage increased by 12.5%, Vorpal Fang damage increased by 34%. Capstones, here comes Trouble. Trouble Bubble, damage increased by 33%. Passive, here comes Trouble. Blood is Magic now increases action skill damage by 8% from 7% per point. Claw and Bang now increases melee damage by 8% from 6% per point. Passives, the fourth seal. Spell Inscriptions, melee damage increased to 7% from 6% per point. Recurrence now increases melee damage by 0.2% per stack, up from the 0.16 per point. Haruspeck's Phase Dagger increased by 11.7%. The dagger already hit hard as heck. This is actually kind of a lot for Vex. Alright, moving on to Amon. Action skills, Scourge. Scourge has had its maximum vengeance increased by 50%, making it able to absorb more damage and deal more damage with Forge Whip when consumed. Forge Whip damage has been increased by 27%. Oh my gosh. Mind you, Forge Whip was already hitting decently hard because he's the one one of my buddies use. And then Scourge is the one my brother's been wow, oh my god. That's insane. Augments, Vengeance, Blast Chill, damage increased by 45%. Molten Rebuke, damage increased by 86%. Eternal Winter, massive Forge Wave damage increased by 100%. Stormlands, damage increased by 52%. Stormlands detonation damage increased by 10%. Those are big numbers. Those are big, scary numbers. Capstones, Vengeance. Glacial Rapture Capstone now has a 60-second cooldown down from 70 seconds. Glacial Rapture Forge Whip damage increased by 16%. Glacial Rapture Fissure damage increased by 41%. Wrathfall damage increased by 46%. Passives, Vengeance. Scourged Kairos now increases ordnance damage by 6%, up from 5% per point. Battleborn now increases gun damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Scar Tissue now increases maximum health and rep kit healing by 9%, up from 8% per point. Eternal now increases action skill duration by 5%, up from 4% per point. World Breaker damage increased by 50%. Winter's Kiss now increases damage dealt by 10%, up from 8% per point. Strike the Anvil now deals 15% of damage dealt, up from 12% per point. Action skills, Crucible, Forge Axe damage increased by 12%. Double-Edged Twins Forge Axe damage increased by 10%. Augment, Cybernetics. Axe and Stones action skill, cooldown restoration increased to 40% from 33%. Axe and Stone's action skill ordnance restoration increased from 40% from 33%. Endless War gun damage taken increased to 20% from 50% per prime stack. Hour of the Hammer Forge Hammer damage increased by 14%. Blade Tempest Forge Sword damage increased by 13%. Blade Tempest Forge Sword detonation damage increased by 4%. Capstone Cybernetics. Snowball damage increased by 38%. Storm Surge impact damage increased by 10%. Storm Surge Forge Storm damage increased by 60%. Conflangerang Capstone's Fire Trail damage now increased by 100%. This makes me want to use Amon. This is wild. I think Amon is is easily one of the most used characters in the game right now, aside from Vex, but the only reason people are using Vex is because of her interaction with the knife and bloodletter. It's just legit making the rest of the game extremely trivial. In terms of actual gameplay, it seems like a lot of people are choosing Amon as either their first character, at least from the videos I've been seeing and then the streams that I've been seeing. A lot of people chose Amon as their very first character. Passives: Cybernetics. Gathering Storm now increases elemental damage by 3% per stack, up from 2% per point. Executioner now increases critical hit damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Destruction Engine now increases force skill damage by 6%, up from 5% per point. Destruction Engine now increases detonation damage up by 8%, up from 6% per point. Tempered Pyre. Forge Axe damage increased by 19%. Tempered Ice. Forge Hammer damage increased by 18%. Masterwork now increases Forge Drones damage by 10% from 7% per point. Masterwork now increases Forge Drones duration by 8% from 5% per point. Tempered Lightning. Forge Sword damage increased by 13%. Lightning Rod Elemental Bolt now deals 40% of the damage dealt, up from 30% per point. Escalation now increases Forge Drone's attack speed and movement speed by 5%, up from 3% per point. Honed Point now increases Forge Drone's critical hit chance by 5%, up from 4% per point. Heat Exchange now increases Cryo and Incendiary damage by 8%, up from 7% per point. Action skills: Onslaughter. Onslaughter's shield regeneration increased to 15% per second from 10%. Onslaughter rocket punch damage increased by 78%. Molten Slam now has a 60-second cooldown from 80 seconds. Molten Slam damage increased by 50%. Augment's Calamity. Felfrost damage increased by 71%. Fulminating Fist damage increased by 69%. Nice. Capstone's Calamity. Horcleave now, really hope I'm saying that right. Horcleave now has a 55-second cooldown from 65 seconds. Horcleave had damage increased by 11%. Horcleave's detonation damage increased by 18%. Molten Royal now has a 70-second cooldown from 80 seconds. Stormcutter has a 65-second cooldown from 75 seconds. Stormcutter damage increased by 65%. Passives: Calamity. Heavy Plate now increases maximum shield capacity by 7%, up from 6% per point. Wield the Storm now increases status effect damage and status effect duration by 7% from 6% per point. Tritanium Knuckles now increases melee damage by 8% from 7% per point. Tritanium Knuckles now increases skill damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Harbinger now increases melee damage by 2% per stack, up from 1% per stack. Mortal Flare damage increased by 22%. Judgment now increases melee damage by 10%, up from 8% per point. And that is your update from October 2nd, 2025. Huge changes. These characters are going to feel a lot more consistent, or at least the builds that are in a sense more inconsistent or feel a lot weaker are now going to feel a lot better. So hey, go out there, play some Vex, play some Rafa, play some Amon, and definitely play Harlow. Just because she got these two little changes today, I'm just saying she is easily one of the best characters in the game. All right, catch you guys in the next one. Later.